December 2008. A 70-year-old man. Penthouse apartment, Upper East Side, Manhattan. 2 FBI agents at his door. He let them in. They asked him one question. Is there an innocent explanation for what we've been told? He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at them and said, "There is no innocent explanation." That morning, $65 billion was gone. 40,000 people had nothing. Retirees who had saved for 40 years wiped out overnight. Charities that fed the poor and housed the homeless destroyed in a day. A Holocaust Survivors Foundation gone. And the man responsible wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't suspicious. He was the most trusted man on Wall Street, former chairman of the NASDAQ, the man governments called when they had questions about how markets worked. And he had been lying to everyone for 17 years. But here's the question nobody ever asks. How did nobody notice? To understand how Bernie Madoff stole $65 billion, you first have to understand something deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't suspicious. He wasn't flashy. He didn't drive a Ferrari or wear gold chains or make promises that sounded too good to be true. Bernie Madoff was the most boring, most respectable, most trusted man in the room. He grew up in Queens, New York. Normal family, normal neighborhood, nothing special. At 22 years old, he scraped together $5,000, money he saved working as a lifeguard and installing garden sprinklers, and he started his own investment firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. Within a decade, that firm was one of the most powerful on Wall Street. He didn't just work on Wall Street, he helped build it. He was one of the key architects of the NASDAQ, the electronic stock exchange that today is worth trillions. He sat on its board. He became its chairman 3 times. When the US government had questions about how financial markets worked, they called Bernie Madoff. When regulators needed guidance, they called Bernie Madoff. When the most powerful banks in Europe wanted to know where to put their clients' money, they called Bernie Madoff. He wasn't just trusted, he was the definition of trust. And that reputation, built over 30 years of legitimate, real, impressive work, was the weapon he would eventually use to destroy tens of thousands of lives. Here is what will shock you most about this entire story. The scheme Bernie Madoff ran was not complicated. It was not sophisticated. It did not require a genius. It did not involve complex financial instruments or elaborate technology. It was embarrassingly simple. Client gives him money, he puts it in a bank account. New client gives him money, he uses that to pay the first client their returns. That's it. That is literally it. No investing, no trading, no strategy. Just moving money from one person's pocket to another and sending out fake statements. This is called a Ponzi scheme, named after a fraudster called Charles Ponzi, who ran a version of it back in 1920. It is one of the oldest tricks in the book. So how did Bernie Madoff run one for 17 years without anyone catching him? Because he was smart enough to be boring. Every other fraudster in history makes the same mistake. They get greedy. They promise 50% returns, 100%, numbers so explosive they attract attention. Madoff promised 10 to 12% a year, every year, without fail. In a bull market, 10 to 12%. In a bear market, 10 to 12%. When the dot-com bubble burst and destroyed entire portfolios, 10 to 12%. When September 11th shook global markets to their core, 10 to 12%. Steady, calm, reliable. And here is the evil genius of that strategy. When every other fund manager was having catastrophic years and Madoff's clients kept getting their returns, nobody thought something is wrong here. They thought, this man is a god. They gave him more money. They told their friends. They told their family. They told their colleagues. And every single person who came in brought the whole thing one step closer to collapse. But nobody knew that yet.
This is the part that makes Madoff a truly different kind of criminal. He never advertised. Not once. No brochures, no cold calls, no seminars, no ads. Because Bernie Madoff did something far more powerful than advertising. He made his fund impossible to get into. You couldn't just call his office and wire him money. You had to be chosen. You had to know someone who knew someone who had already been chosen. He moved through the most elite circles in America, the country clubs of Palm Beach, the charity galas of Manhattan, the private dining rooms of the Hamptons. And at every one of those events, in every one of those rooms, the whisper was the same. If you can get in with Madoff, get in. People begged to give him their money. Hedge funds restructured themselves entirely just to funnel money into his firm. Wealthy families, some of whom had been building their fortunes for generations, handed him everything. Banks in Switzerland, banks in Spain, banks in France, all of them rushing to get their clients' money into Madoff's hands. And then there were the charities, the nonprofits, the foundations, the organizations built to feed the poor, support the sick, preserve history. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, built by a Holocaust survivor who had already lost everything once before, invested $15 million with Bernie Madoff. $15 million. Gone. At its peak, Bernie Madoff was managing somewhere between $17 billion and $65 billion. 40,000 people across 136 countries trusted this man with their futures, and every single one of them was being robbed. In 1999, a financial analyst named Harry Markopolos was asked by his firm to study Madoff's strategy. The idea was simple: figure out what Madoff was doing so they could copy it. Markopolos sat down with the numbers. He studied them for 4 hours, and then he put his pen down, because what he was looking at was mathematically impossible. The returns Madoff claimed to be generating could not exist, not in any market, not with any strategy, not under any conditions. The numbers were fake. Markopolos was so certain and so shaken that he went straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the most powerful financial regulator in the United States, the organization created specifically to protect investors from exactly this kind of fraud. He laid out his evidence. They did nothing. He went back in 2001. More evidence, more detail. Nothing. 2005, a 17-page report breaking down the fraud point by point. Nothing. 2007, nothing. 2008, nothing. 5 times over 9 years, Harry Markopolos handed the SEC a roadmap to Bernie Madoff's fraud. And 5 times they looked at it, looked at Madoff's reputation, and decided, surely not. Markopolos later said he feared for his life during those years, that he kept a gun in his car, that he varied his routes to work every day because he was afraid of being followed, that he genuinely believed if the wrong people found out what he was doing, he would not survive it. And still, nobody listened. September 2008, Lehman Brothers, one of the most powerful investment banks in the world, collapsed overnight. The global financial system went into free fall. Stock markets crashed, banks froze, panic spread from Wall Street to every corner of the planet. And for Bernie Madoff, this was the moment he had always known was coming. Because when markets crash, people need their money back, all at once. Withdrawals started flooding in from every direction. In a real investment fund, painful but survivable. In a Ponzi scheme, a death sentence. Madoff needed $7 billion to cover what his clients were pulling out. He had $200 million. It was over. On the evening of December 10, 2008, Bernie Madoff called his 2 sons, Mark and Andrew, both of whom worked at the firm, and asked them to come to his apartment. He sat them down. He took a breath, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Bernie Madoff told the truth. He told them the investment advisory business was a fraud, that it had always been a fraud, that every statement, every return, every report sent to every client for 17 years was completely fabricated, that there was nothing left. He asked for 1 week, just 1 week before they said anything. He wanted to use what little remained to pay employees and family members first. His sons looked at him and said no. The next morning, they called a lawyer. 24 hours later, 2 FBI agents knocked on the door of Bernie Madoff's penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. He answered the door himself. They asked if there was an innocent explanation. And just like we told you at the very beginning, he said, there is no innocent explanation.
What came next was devastating on a scale that is difficult to put into words. Retirees who had spent 40 years building their savings gone in a single day. Families who had trusted Madoff across multiple generations destroyed completely. A French aristocrat named René Thierry Magon de la Ville-Huchet had personally introduced dozens of his closest friends to Madoff. When the fraud was exposed, he couldn't live with what he had done to the people he loved. He locked himself in his office and took his own life. Bernie Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison. His son Mark, unable to cope with the shame, the hatred, the complete destruction of everything he had ever known, took his own life on December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest. His other son, Andrew, died of lymphoma in 2014. He believed until the very end that the stress of living under his father's shadow had accelerated his illness. Bernie Madoff died in federal prison on April 14, 2021. He was 82 years old. Investigators spent over a decade trying to recover money for victims. They managed to return $14 billion out of $65 billion, less than a quarter. The rest is simply gone. So I want to ask you something. How does one man steal $65 billion from 40,000 people across 136 countries for 17 years? With regulators investigating him, whistleblowers warning about him, and the entire financial world watching him, and nobody stops him. The answer isn't that Bernie Madoff was a genius. The answer is that he understood something about human beings that most people never want to admit. We trust who other people trust. We stop asking questions when the answers have always been good. We want to believe that someone with a perfect track record and an impeccable reputation could never be lying to us. And that blind spot, that is more dangerous than any con ever invented. Bernie Madoff didn't find a loophole in the financial system. He found a loophole in us. And the truly terrifying thing? That loophole hasn't been closed. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is sitting in a beautiful office with an impressive track record and a warm handshake, and people are lining up to give them everything they have. So before you trust anyone with your money, ask the hard questions, demand the real answers, because the next Bernie Madoff isn't going to look like a criminal. He never does. If this story shook you, good. That means you're paying attention. That's exactly what ClearPath Finance is here for. Every week, we break down the biggest financial crimes, scams, and money stories in history, not just to entertain you, but to arm you. Because the best protection against being scammed is knowing exactly how it's done. Hit subscribe. It's free. And next week, we're going inside the most reckless, most outrageous Wall Street scam ever lived. The real Wolf of Wall Street, not the movie, the truth. Trust me, it's worse.